Welcome to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carrol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. We're here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City.
This week, fragile China as coronavirus cases top 75,000. We explore if the economy can navigate the latest threat to its debt-fueled boom.
And a huge fan of Trump's steel tariffs. Well, he's now suing over them. We hear from the JSW Steel USA CEO himself.
Plus, digital loans, they are flooding Kenya, offering to lift users out of poverty, but many actually ending up in debt.
But we begin where we probably have to.
Yeah.
What a week in politics.
Right, from presidential pardons to a much-watched debate. Here with the Roundup, politics editor Wendy Benjaminson. She joins us in D.C. So, Wendy, we got to start with the debate. Certainly a big deal. And it was a heated debate. Talk to us about it. What were the major takeaways?
Well, it was a very heated debate. It was they've had 9 debates now, and this was by far the most lively. And, even though Bernie Sanders is the front runner, they had one target, and it was Michael Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. But he has been rising in the polls, entirely self-funding his campaign. And as he rises in the polls, more and more has come out about things he said in the past and other issues. And the other Democrats, especially the centrists and the female candidates, were really there to take him out, and they did their best to do so.
Well, and let's talk about that. Elizabeth Warren came out hot, and she seemed to have really the best performance she's had in some time,
right,
if not ever, through this whole cycle.
Well, she had a very, very strong performance, and she really needed to give her campaign some CPR, and I think that's what she did. She really had flagged through Iowa and New Hampshire, coming in third, coming in fourth, I think, in New Hampshire, and she was really looking like she was going to be left behind. And if there was an opportunity last night to revive her campaign, she might have done it. Not only did she attack Bloomberg, but she went and defended Amy Klobuchar and really presented herself as sort of the grown-up at the table.
Yeah, it was interesting. What about for Bernie Sanders, right? He has been certainly the front runner, it feels like, here. How did he fare? He did very well. He defended his position. I don't think he did himself any real harm. Bernie is Bernie, and that is one of the things that has propelled him to front-runner status. He does not tack to the left or the right based on anything. This is who he is, love him or leave him. That's really how he feels, and he was just himself last night. He had some interesting sparring with Bloomberg over his own wealth and over socialism, but, he seemed to have survived the night unscathed. What I thought was interesting, Wendy, about the debate, too, was very much everybody going after one another. It wasn't about thinking about defeating President Trump, I felt like, largely.
No, it wasn't. But remember, this is the Democratic primary.
Right.
And in the Democratic primary, one of them has to emerge as the victor. The trouble is, there are some people who are worried about a repeat of 2016, where the primary candidates spend so much time fighting with each other that whoever is the nominee comes out sort of battered and bruised and out of money and, ill-equipped to fight the general election, as Hillary Clinton might have been in 2016. So I do think they want to, at some point, begin to avoid that. The trouble is the progressives seem to have rallied around Bernie Sanders. The centrists have a lot of choices there, and no one seems to have really emerged as the favorite.
All right. Well, Wendy, meanwhile, in Washington this week, a lot of people on Wall Street here in New York were captivated by the pardons by President Trump, especially Michael Milken, well-known financier, has sort of had this amazing sort of second life as a philanthropist. Give us some context for these pardons and commutations that we saw this week.
Well, certainly the president feels unleashed since his own acquittal in the impeachment trial just recently. And so he is feeling like he has power to use. And so he is, proceeding with these pardons. There is a normal process for pardons. Presidents do have this power. They use it quite often. Bill Clinton did after his own impeachment was over. But Trump doesn't let it go through the process. He sort of listens to lobbying that's done on Fox News. He listens to lobbying done by friends and, colleagues from around his world pre-politics, and then acts on that lobbying. And I think that's where a lot of these pardons came from.
Are they done? Because I know that there's been some other stories about maybe some other folks that he might be considering pardoning. Could we expect more news in the next couple of weeks, maybe?
Well, this is Donald Trump, so your guess is as good as mine.
Wendy Benjaminson in D.C., thank you so much. We really appreciate the context.
And we do
Thanks
want to
for
remind
having me.
everybody with the debates, of course, Michael Bloomberg, as we did hear from Wendy, he is, of course, the majority owner and founder here of Bloomberg LP and, of course, the home of Bloomberg News.
Now let's get inside this week's edition of the magazine. Here's editor Joel Weber. China's still obviously top of mind. We heard about politics from Wendy Benjaminson. What do you make of this issue?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing of all is the repercussions of the coronavirus situation and like the impact that it's really had globally already, and we're continuing to see cases and deaths mount. But the biggest reason that we put this on the cover was, of course, like the economic implications of something like this, and the skeptics of China, the bears out there, have been thinking that there's going to be a spark for a while, and the question remains whether or not the coronavirus is sort of one of those things that proves to be a tipping moment.
Yeah, right. If you think about the protests that have gone on, and in terms of the debt situation, concern about growing debt in China, that's been around for a few years.
Yeah, the debt one has been longer than a few years, really, right? But the thing is, it's never actually tipped.
Right.
And this, in some ways, there's been a lack of a catalyst, and the biggest question of all is like, is this that catalyst that suddenly workers aren't getting paid, that factories remain furloughed, those things start to mount, and all of a sudden, puts China in a precarious situation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about steel. A little closer to home, but
This is a
obviously
great story.
tied up even in the relationship with China because the tariffs really and the trade war really affected all of that. That story, we've been able to sort of take it from a couple different angles. Just a fascinating one.
Yeah, a big one, and the headline that we used online for this, I think, really told the story the best, which was the biggest fan of Trump's steel tariffs is suing over them.
Yeah.
And you really just get the sense of it.
Like what?
Yeah, exactly. The tariffs were intended to help American manufacturing and bring back the steel industry, and yet they've almost had an adverse effect because of the lack of exemptions that have been honored. And one of the companies that we focus on, JSW Steel, which is actually, there's a foreign element to this, and that's where they've really found themselves in the crosshairs. But, as you basically heard from the CEO, this was all about bringing back jobs.
Right.
And so far, they've invested $1 billion and not really been able to increase output or add jobs.
I also love it because I feel like in all the stories that you guys have done in the magazine about trade, like we talk about, there's a lot of nuances. It's tricky when you're figuring out trade details, and a company like this that can be in favor but then gets caught up in it.
Yeah, this nuance thing is not the thing that the Commerce Department excels at. And that's ultimately what this is about, suing over these exemptions.
All right, you have a little person at your house. I have a little person at my house. Coco Melon. I have to say, I loved this story. I didn't even know that much about it.
Yeah.
And yet, no one did because this is like a secret genius.
Well, 2.5 billion users know about it, or viewers.
True.
Yeah, that's right. So this story is about a really popular YouTube channel, especially with the kids, called Coco Melon. And this is it gets watched a ton by kids, and no one's ever known anything about him. So we had a very interesting interview with the founder, who's very secretive, about sort of the aspirations to grow this. And one of the things that's interesting is all the revenue that he's been generating on the YouTube front has been ad-driven, but now there's a change to that model. And in order to sort of continue to grow this brand organically, he's looking out into merchandise and other things.
It's sort of amazing, too. I mean, it's a story not just about this site, but about streaming and YouTube and the ambitions and the changing media landscape.
That's right. And to do it through animation, all of these are handcrafted. I watched it with my kid, kind of couldn't look away, and I was horrified in the process. But, it gets to, the changing nature of how content, and especially how kids are interacting with that content.
You're like, honey, Henry and I are working right now.
Joel, HR is calling me. You have to stop watching them at work. I'm just telling you. All right.
Joel, thanks a lot.
Well, coming up next, more on the cover story. We have to get back to that. It's a good one. It's about fragile China, how the coronavirus outbreak could further strain its already stressed out banks.
And our conversation with JSW Steel USA's CEO, as Joel just mentioned, initially a fan of Trump's tariffs, now suing over them. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. Join Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by checking out our podcast.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And now you can watch us every day on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News.
For several years, we've heard predictions that China was headed for a financial crash. Well, they haven't come true yet.
And yet, Chinese policymakers, they have a delicate job. It's this week's cover story, Fragile China, and it's also the subject of this week's BusinessWeek Explainer. Back in 2010, investor Jim Chanos, he called China's reliance on real estate for growth a, quote, treadmill to hell. George Soros and the IMF joined in. All forecast dire things would happen in China because of everything from shadow loans to a housing bubble. Now the coronavirus outbreak has some unnerved. The stakes are huge. Total debt has soared to more than 300% of GDP. Household debt has surged to 53% of GDP, 5 times what it was in 2007. Regulators have pledged to clean up the systemic risks. They've cracked down on excessive lending from shadow banks, the companies that lend outside normal banking channels, and they've made it tougher in some cases to get mortgages. But chipping away at debt without crushing growth, well, that's a delicate business, and the coronavirus could shake things up. Chinese banks are being told to boost lending and lower rates in stricken areas.
And for more on the coronavirus hitting a, quote, fragile China,
here's my conversation with finance editor Pat Regnier.
The coronavirus, I mean, we're beginning to see, like, you know, when you look to one institution to control everything, I mean, right now they are having, you know, huge issues containing, a difficult outbreak.
Right.
And all of those things get kind of, tied up together. Are they managing that competently? And if they're managing that competently or not, how do we take that to for how they're going to be able to manage and fine tune the economy?
What do we know so far as you look at this through a financial lens?
Well, I think for a lot of people, what's interesting and what, we asked our writers in Hong Kong, Tracy Alloway, to ask is, are people, blurring these two things together?
Yes.
Or are they compartmentalizing it? Like there's economic management over here and there's virus management over here. And, I think you're actually beginning to see some of that blurring together. And yet, here in the U.S., if you look at how markets are responding, even with all this stuff happening in the world's second largest economy, people still seem to not be quite ready to look at this as an economic crisis.
Yeah. Does that surprise you as someone who's looked at the world through that economic and financial lens for a long time?
Well, as we've said, people have been calling a crisis in China for a decade. I mean, so in a sense, it doesn't surprise me in that, it's always very hard to call the top of something. And I think, most people in the United States and Europe are still working to kind of get their heads around all the size and the pace of change in China.
Right. Well, and we shouldn't forget, one of the elements that brought this to the fore, two things actually. One is the trade war, that obviously sort of put the Chinese economy in a different light, and then something as seemingly separate but important, especially to our financial audience, as the protests in Hong Kong.
Right.
All of this sort of starts to play into this stew in a way.
It's all happening at once. And again, now that's something that I think a lot of people in the United States or the UK may experience too. Like suddenly all the news is happening at once, and it seems like we're all kind of caught in these cycles of all this, and look at all those places, the U.S. and Europe. I mean, the markets have kind of trundled along.
Right, exactly. Well, and the Hong Kong one, I think about some of the work you and I have done together around the financial system, the big financial firms, and wrestling with how to understand Hong Kong and its role in the broader financial world, which brings me to one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about, which is the role of the banking system and the government's role in all of that state control, lack of state control. Where does the banking system fit into all of this?
Well, I mean, this is one of the key levers that that Chinese authorities have to pull. They can control interest rates. They can control lending. They particularly have to think about the rise of shadow banking. That's such an important factor in China. The rise of these financial institutions that are outside of the traditional lending system. And when we were talking about P2P, just the rise in the amount of debt outstanding in peer-to-peer lending a few years ago, and then how quickly. That was brought down. I mean, you don't see changes of that scale without a crisis happening in most other countries.
Well, China obviously struggling on a few fronts these days, the latest, of course, being the coronavirus, Carol.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Jason. We turn now to, though, the virus's economic impact on companies right here in the U.S. Kaylee Lyons joins us now with the chart. And that's what we've been following big time over the last couple of weeks here.
Well, we've heard from dozens and dozens of them, and it ranges from apparel companies like Under Armour to tech companies like Apple, which really spooked markets this week when it said it doesn't expect to meet its revenue guidance for the current quarter. But that's for the current quarter. And actually, when you look at earnings revision since the virus fears really crept into the market per sector for technology and companies like Apple, they're actually holding up. They've actually risen about 3% from mid-January. It's also holding up for the likes of consumer discretionary. Healthcare is roughly flat. But what we are noticing is that it's those cyclical growth sensitive sectors that have really been hit the hardest. For materials, energy, and industrials, earnings estimates have been revised down by more than 5%.
And in that chart, just to be fair for everybody watching, that white line is technology, green is consumer discretionary, purple line is healthcare. As you said, it was flat, but materials, energy, you can see in some of the names that have been at the bottom of the chart that are getting hurt.
Leading the way down.
Yeah.
I mean, what's so interesting too is we watched this sort of all week. This reaction,
so.
Apple warns and Apple's down, and then the next day pops right back up. I mean, these tech stocks, especially, so resilient.
Well, there seems to be this narrative in the market that yes, there is going to be an impact, but it's going to be in the shorter, nearer term. That there's going to be a rebound later in the year when this virus finally is a more resolved situation. But of course, that is a very large unknown.
Right. At some point, it's backward looking, right? At some point, when we feel like we're getting it under control, we can say, okay, we can put some, an end to it at some point. All right, Kaylee, great stuff as always. Kaylee Lyons.
All right, up next, why a fan of Trump's steel tariffs is now suing the government over them.
Yeah, you heard that right. Plus, fixing the education gap, Maryland experiments. We'll tell you about that one. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
Back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. You can also listen to Bloomberg BusinessWeek on the radio on Sirius XM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app.
And you can watch us daily on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com, search Bloomberg Global News. The main character in a story in this week's features section, a steel company and its CEO that was in favor of the Trump administration's tariffs until he wasn't.
And he came here to talk with us in New York City. Here's our conversation with the CEO and president of JSW Steel USA, Joe Horitz.
I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio.
Yeah.
I started working in the steel mills when I was 18. And over time, as I progressed in my career, I watched tens of thousands of jobs disappear because many of the steel companies were not keeping up with the great new technology that was being designed all over the world. So this was like a step down back in memory road or memory lane, whatever. And this big, beautiful plate mill that was 40 years old was built by U.S. Steel, my first employer. So this was an opportunity to redo something. I was a design engineer. You know what the story says, and I've done a lot of things with regard to steelmaking for 40-some years. And so we had now this wonderful opportunity to bring back jobs, install incredible equipment. Then the tariffs hit us, and they hit us hard.
Why did they hit you hard? Especially since you were a backer of them initially, and you thought it would be a good thing, right?
Well, here's what happened. The tariffs were announced, and we knew we would have to pay tariffs because we get 12-inch thick slabs of steel. The only company that could provide them at that point in time. There was no one in this country that could, unfortunately. You have to have a slab caster to make these giant slabs. And there is not yet today a caster in this country that can make 12-inch slabs. So we were getting them from our parent company in India, and also 8 and 10-inch slabs. Those were coming from Mexico and from an ArcelorMittal plant in Mexico. And they're very high tech from a chemistry standpoint to make line pipe, right? But also plate. But the 12-inch slabs, we had to get from our parent. So,
and the point is, and I think what I love about this story is we get like a history lesson, right, of the protections on the steel industry. And there were times where the Commerce Department, go back to, 2001, right, where there were tariffs imposed to protect things that were considered, vital to our national security. Correct. And so this is what's been going on. But you're saying that these slabs are not produced here. So the only way to get them is you have to import them. It's not like we're protecting some domestic industry here.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
And so basically the tariffs that were meant to help you were hurting you on the other side.
Yes. But we thought, because there was an exclusion methodology that you could file with the Commerce Department, that we would get all of our tariff money back.
Right.
And in May of 18, we filed for exclusions, and they got denied a year later. And I was so optimistic they were going to get approved. Now, when you're paying 25% more for something,
it's a big deal.
It's a big, big deal. And so we were going to invest $500 million in Baytown, Texas. Tremendous story and a lot of fun. And when we got hit with the tariffs and then we couldn't get them back, we spent at least $50 million on tariffs. And that's when we had to make the decision not to put the hot end in Baytown. So that was it was a bad time. Yeah, I was feeling really horrible about it all. And so,
but you still support the administration. How is that possible?
I support the administration because of the dumping issue. I don't support what they've done with the tariff issue. Our action, as you know, we're bringing we're suing the Commerce Department and the trade court. Now, we don't think they were fair to us. I know they weren't, because we told the truth. We said we cannot get these slabs in this country.
Is it making you slow down on spending and creating a much more viable business and job creation as a result, or what?
If we stick with it, and that's my plan, we will have the viable business that we anticipated. But it's slowing us down tremendously. And, when you get slowed down like this, who knows what the future is going to bring, right?
Or what economic cycle you might then ultimately move into?
So right now we're in kind of a dip in the cyclicality of our industry, and nevertheless we're still moving along. Right. But as I said, slower than we should be.
And you can catch our entire interview with JSW USA CEO on our Business Week Extra podcast.
Up next, the challenges of both higher and lower education.
Maryland, it is eyeing different ways to fund schools, and the University of Minnesota, it is tackling social challenges.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. Still ahead, startups are flooding Kenya with apps offering high-interest loans, empowering the poor or profiting from desperation. It's a good question.
It is indeed. Plus, we speak with the CEO of Curaleaf. That's the largest U.S. cannabis company. He talks about the outlook for his industry.
And then we've got YouTube's shyest superstar, a BusinessWeek exclusive with the quiet crew behind the internet's most popular kids channel.
Quiet maybe, but you're not going to be able to get it out of your
Yeah,
head.
you won't.
First up, though, rising inequality. That's at the heart of U.S. public debate, looming over many issues, including America's classrooms. Here's my conversation with the editor of the economics section, Christina Lindblad. She talks about a story about one state's plan to address just that.
Maryland's legislature is considering a plan put together by the Kirwan Commission that would basically not completely alter the way education is financed, but sort of lean against some of kind of the how the system works. There's a reliance in the U.S. on property taxes at the local level to finance education, which tends to reinforce outcomes, so poor places have less money, raise less money from property taxes, less money for education. So that it's a negative feedback loop, right? So the commission has identified a plan. It's not a cheap fix. It's $4 billion that would basically have states contribute more funds targeting places where there is greater need and hardship.
Well, and we should point out that so this commission, the Kirwan Commission, is named after the former University of Maryland Chancellor William Kirwan. And Maryland, I think sometimes people forget, especially people who spend time in Washington, D.C. We're not talking about Bethesda or Chevy Chase here. We're talking about a part of Maryland that's out in the Appalachian area of the country, right?
That's right. It's way, way east. It's a county. The county we looked at particularly in one school that has actually been doing great in producing good outcomes, but it talks about sort of like the resources that it needs. But it's like 12% poverty. There is need in these places, and they're running out of money to do some of the things that they want to do. So, I mean, in the U.S., there's been this great search across the country, and a lot of different states have been trying things. The people we talk to say this is one of the most ambitious plans they've seen in recent years. So,
right, and I mean, and let's talk about some of the details. We're talking about full day pre-K for children as young as 3.
That's right.
Oftentimes that doesn't start until a little bit later. Family support centers and expansion there. Improved pay and career path for teachers. We talk about that all the time, but maybe they're putting that into action. And as you say, this is something that's trying to arrest, as it were, this negative feedback loop that happens, especially in poorer parts of the country.
Yeah, I think the idea is to sort of bomb with resources like these areas, and not just like, curriculum and education, but this idea that you need support, not just for the kids, but for the families. So, they have counselors in the schools, but they're also going to have these family centers, to help out like households.
Right. And do you get a sense that, this is just one of these intractable problems that has to be solved at the local level? I just think about the work that you guys do at the magazine and trying to understand, micro versus macroeconomics. In some ways, this feels like a macro issue that may have to be solved in a micro way.
Well, in the way that education is financed in the United States, federal government has it's funny because you hear a lot, especially at election years, about education. Yeah. But then if you look at actually how the breakdown of financing is, the federal government provides very little money for primary education. So I think it is an issue that needs to be solved at the state level, but hopefully there's kind of knowledge sharing, and there is, right? So states can look at each other and see what is working.
Inequality in education is also a problem in higher education.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's why I was so excited to catch up with an old friend of mine. She's got a new job, new-ish. She's the president of the University of Minnesota. Her name is Joan Gable. She took that job just over a year ago. And let me tell you, she's already got some big plans.
We have the social challenges, which is the idea that, especially in public higher education, which is the space that I'm in, we exist in order to serve. We're mission bound. And so we need to be accessible. And that means we need to be affordable, and we need to be welcoming so that everyone who comes on board has the same chance for success that every other person who comes on board has. So that's one category. And then we have this sort of social value proposition question where some people are really wondering whether we really do something that's worth doing, worth paying for, worth spending time on. And then we have the research question for those of us at research institutions, where the fact that we engage in scholarship, that we're in large part existing to explore and solve problems and be theoretical and inquire, is questioned as valuable as well. And then add a little technology competition, a little literal competition, for profits, et cetera. It's a very interesting time.
So let's talk about the social value proposition. I mean, let's go right there, because there are big existential questions around, should kids go and spend 4 years, especially away from home, out of the job force, maybe learning some things that aren't necessarily exactly applicable? You and I went to liberal arts colleges growing up. What's the case?
Well, you could look at it very two-dimensionally, that earning potential is higher if you have a college degree.
Right.
And that hasn't tapered at all, despite all of this conversation. In fact, it has only gotten stronger as a matter of just, is it worth the investment of time and money? Every indicator from an ROI point of view is yes. But there's also the social quality that you get from having been on a college campus, what it means to have that network, what it means to have that sense of identity, what it means to fail with some sense of safe space and recover, what it is to explore who you are, question things, be challenged. We offer all of that, and we think that makes you better for the totality of your life afterwards. So you're prepared for work, but you're also prepared to think and discern and critically analyze, and we think that's kind of important.
Right. All right, so let's go to the mission-bound piece of this. How do you distinguish your mission at University of Minnesota from everybody else?
Well, we are the only research university in the state of Minnesota. So we have this very interesting intersection between being the place and also being world-class. So total sense of place, deep commitment to access, but also very keen on excellence and being a global player in the questions that we explore and the quality of the teaching that we do. And so we think we've really held on to that in a way that some of our competitors have not, that we are both accessible and excellent. It's not an either or. And so we commit to the land-grant mission that was our founding core set of values over 165 years ago. And we do really cutting-edge research and launch really innovative programs.
And for the entirety of my wide-ranging conversation with Joan Gable, the president of the University of Minnesota, check out our Business Week Extra podcast.
Coming up, the team behind Coco Melon. If you haven't heard of it, well, you aren't hanging out apparently with toddlers. It's YouTube's most popular kids channel.
And the second most popular channel overall. It's got 2.5 billion views a month. And just a reminder, it's dedicated to nursery rhymes.
You're going to like it. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. Join Bloomberg Business Week every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by checking out our podcast.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. And now you can watch us every day on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. Well, from microcredit to major debt, startups are flooding Kenya with apps that offer high-interest loans. But it raises the question, are they empowering the poor or profiting from desperation?
Well, that question and that story tackled in the features section. Here's reporter Zeke Fox.
Tala is, by all measures, a hot startup. I mean, several years old now, but they've raised more than $200 million. They're in Santa Monica, and they have an app that makes small loans to people in developing countries. Kenya was the first market that they tested. So anyone can download the app and apply for a loan of $10 or $20.
It's like microloans. That's exactly what it is.
Right. Real tiny loans. And the pitch for it is that this is going to help the woman who has a vegetable stand to buy some more tomatoes, and then she can sell them, repay the loan, and improve her business and perhaps lift herself out of poverty. And the Tala has gotten great publicity for this. The founder, Shivani Soroya, is a regular at conferences giving a spiel about this. And
TED Talks, right? I mean,
TED Talk.
Really popular.
Yeah. So, but what she doesn't talk about is that the app charges quite a high interest rate. It's 180% annualized. So that's about 10 times what you would pay on, your credit card. Now, the loans are short term. So the idea is that you'd borrow $10 and then you'd pay back $11.50 next month. And put that way, it doesn't sound that bad. But
until you can't pay it back.
Right. I mean, and
the interest keeps building. Right.
So actually, the way that Tala works is if you pay late, they charge you a one-time late fee, and then they stop accumulating interest. The problem is that I found when interviewing people in Kenya is that many people would borrow from Tala, then they would struggle to pay back the loan because to us, $10 seems very small. But the loans go as big as $300. And for some people, it could be more than they make in a whole month.
Right.
So when the loan comes due, they borrow from other apps in order to pay back Tala. Because this digital lending is in a real boom in Kenya. There's more than 50 apps that are offering these kinds of loans. So I spoke to people who every month were taking out 5 loans, 6 loans, paying off one with the other. And when you added up all the interest charges they were paying, it was a significant part of their income.
Right. So it's not like we're used to seeing in the United States where it's like a credit card bill that just sort of keeps rolling over. It's sort of interest on interest from different providers. And this is a booming business, as you say.
Yeah. Essentially, the loans are pretty similar to payday loans in the U.S., where you get a small amount of money and you're supposed to pay it all back in 2 weeks or 1 month. And for people in Kenya, this is really... it's really new. Most people have never borrowed from a bank or a credit card company. But the reason it's such an attractive market is that more than 10 years ago, the Safaricom, which is the biggest cell phone operator there, created an app called M-Pesa, which is basically like Venmo here. And it's super popular. So people who don't have bank accounts are still using M-Pesa to buy food, to pay their rent, to get paid. People use it all day long. So that's what let Tala and other apps come in. They use that infrastructure to provide the loans to people and get repaid.
Turning now to another untold tech story, though, let's be fair, this is a much lighter one. We're talking about YouTube's shyest superstar.
What we're talking about is the internet's most popular kids channel. It's called CoComelon, and it's run by a skeleton crew and owned by a 55-year-old guy and his wife in a quiet Southern California suburb.
Yep, you heard that right. Here's our conversation with Lucas Shaw in LA.
It's a classic story of this YouTube generation where just about anybody can become one of the most influential or most famous media personalities in the world. He kind of came to Southern California from Korea a long time ago. He was a commercial director, made different projects for advertisers, and decided with his wife, when they had a couple of small kids, that they wanted to make videos for them. His wife illustrates children's books, and he obviously is a filmmaker, and so they collaborated on pretty basic 2D animation. They did it enough that they started to really like it. They built a following. They had to keep their jobs for a while. After several years, they had built enough of a following that they could leave their jobs, but it was still, modest. Tens of millions of views a month. Nobody's idea of the most popular kids channel in the world. But then, just bang! A couple of years ago, after more than a decade of running this channel, their views just take off. They go from about 100 million views a month to more than 2 billion views a month. In less than a couple of years, and now it is the second biggest channel on YouTube in the world, and the average video gets tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of views, and they're trying to figure out now, what do we do with this thing that we built?
Well, that's what's interesting. First of all, you keep saying they, and I feel like you're being a little evasive. Who are they? Because, there were conditions for doing this story and actually sitting down and talking with the founders behind this.
Yeah, this was the first interview that this guy Jay John had ever done. He's really avoided press, and the they is Jay and his wife. There were a lot of things that he either didn't want us to mention in the story, or that he just wouldn't go into at all, would kind of refuse to address. He's a very mild-mannered Korean American, 55 years old, lives in, or at least works in Irvine, California, which is in Orange County, about an hour and a half half south of Los Angeles, and was inspired a little bit because there was a growing amount of press about kids' channels on YouTube and how we don't know who's behind them, and do we want our kids watching videos from unknown people? Could be shadowy, lots of unsavory programming on YouTube, so maybe there were people with ulterior motives. And I think he wanted to set the record straight that there's nothing nefarious about him. He's just sort of a quiet guy who has a wife and 2 kids and wants to keep making videos.
Still to come, we catch up with the Curaleaf CEO, Joe Lusardi.
He runs the largest cannabis company by footprint, so he was the perfect person to ask about what's next for this growing industry.
Growing, I get it. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carrol Massar. You can also listen to us on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area and London on DAB Digital and through the Bloomberg Business app. And you can watch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com and search Bloomberg Global News. And that's where you can listen to and watch interviews like this one with Curaleaf CEO Joe Lusardi.
The largest U.S. cannabis company based in Wakefield, Massachusetts. We caught up with him in Boston and talked about the future of cannabis and the company's recent acquisitions.
Vermont likely will do an adult use sales program. States like Mississippi and South Dakota have initiatives on the ballot. So you could see 3 or 4 new states for medical and a handful of new states for adult use. Utah just enacted a program. Curaleaf was fortunate enough to win one of the 14 licenses in Utah. So we'll be entering that state later this year. And we're really excited about where the country is in the progression of cannabis across the states.
So, Joe, you guys have been pretty acquisitive. I think it's fair to say. A lot of deal making going on in general. You closed on your acquisition of Select. That obviously was a big deal. Tell us about, if you can, an update on the purchase of Grassroots. I believe that's under federal review or under DOJ review?
Yeah, so Grassroots is going to be a very transformative acquisition for the company. It really gets us into key markets, including Illinois, Michigan. They've got a big presence in Pennsylvania and Maryland. We announced 2 weeks ago that we cleared the DOJ review, the HSR hurdle, and so now we're just working with state regulators to transfer the licenses, and we expect to close the deal in the spring.
And more deals to come?
Well, we're always on the lookout. I mean, we're not afraid to hit singles. There are a number of states where we operate in where we could do some bolt-ons, and we're always looking to deploy capital into accretive acquisition. So we're on the hunt and always active.
I mean, it feels like, given some of the, shall we say, sort of turbulence in the market last year, that maybe some of the smaller names could be looking for a way out. Are you seeing people sort of either pitch themselves or bankers pitching a little bit more fervently these days?
Yeah, I think the M&A activity will intensify this year. There are definitely a lot of small operators that want to find a dance partner and hitch their wagon to some of the bigger players. We did a big capital raise early this year. We did a $300 million raise, and so the balance sheet is well fortified to go out and be opportunistic. And we'll make sure we pick our shots carefully, but it looks like it's a very good year for acquisitions.
You and I talked a lot too about the vaping scare and the impact that has had on you and kind of the industry specifically. Where are we on that? And any of your thoughts in terms of maybe, rolling back any vaping exposure?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in that, what that really highlighted was a greater awareness for people about what they put in their bodies. And so I think we're seeing a trend where people are gravitating to the regulated market. And I actually expect the vape category to continue to grow. There's a lot of innovation in the sector. There's new products and form factors coming all the time. And consumers have shown a real strong preference for that form factor. So I think it's going to continue to grow.
Joe, as you know, getting the state approval, that's really cool and all. But the kind of holy grail is getting the federal government to allow weed, right? Because that has certainly, without that, kind of scared off the financial industry, and you need that in order to be able to kind of, do financial transactions easily from state to state. So what do you think about federal government signing off on this anytime soon this year?
Well, in an election year, it's hard to really predict what happens in D.C. And of course, there's some overhang from the impeachment stuff. But, what I think is telling is that if you look at even the Democratic presidential field, every candidate is pro-cannabis in some form or another. It's quite unpopular to be anti-cannabis at this point. We have 33 states with medical programs. I think we've reached more than a tipping point. I spent a lot of time in D.C. I will say clearly it's not a partisan issue, that, it covers people from both sides of the aisle. So I think it will happen, probably in the next 12 to 24 months, worst case.
All right, turning now to Pursuits, the opener in the magazine. It is all about puzzles. I love puzzles.
You want to know how the 0.1% torture themselves? Well, Devin Leonard, he's got the answer.
It was founded by a guy who sort of calls himself the chief tormentor, this guy, Steve Richardson. And that's basically sort of, he sort of fell into making puzzles. I mean, he'd been laid off from his job at a computer company in Hanover, New Hampshire. And so he and another guy who we worked with, started making sort of board games, really. I mean, these guys were just flailing around.
Right.
And then one day, some rich guy from Boston calls him up and says, I guess they were also making these cheap cardboard jigsaw puzzles. He said, "Do you make wooden ones? Because I would pay $300 for a puzzle." And they were saying, "Well, yeah, because we were selling ours for $3." So basically, they started making puzzles for these guys, and they just found all these people right away, all these rich folks who another company had been making puzzles. They sort of went out of business, and they picked up all these rich people. But then to keep them sort of engaged, addicted, they had to keep making the puzzles harder and harder and harder. And anyway, it just goes on from there.
It feels like Eyes Wide Shut for puzzles. You know what I mean? It's like I'm reading this story and just thinking, as you say, this secret society. Tell us about these puzzles, though.
Well, first of all, as you said before, they're very expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, they range in price from about $300 to $10,000. They can be more than that if they're custom made. And a lot of these people have the money; they want custom made puzzles. But generally, they come in a blue box, so you don't know what they look like. So anybody
There's no
who's ever
picture
done a puzzle,
right on top. Most puzzles have.
And then they don't have, a lot of them don't have straight edges, because usually when people put puzzles together, that's what they work from, they kind of work their inside, so you can't do that. And then they throw in puzzle pieces that don't fit. So you're sitting there trying to fit these pieces, and that don't fit. And then to make the puzzles harder, they came up with things like making these puzzles. There's one called the Main Event, where it's a lion's head. Most of the pieces are almost the same color, and they're the same size pretty much. So trying to put that together, how do you do that? So that drives people crazy. And there's another one called Olivia that's kind of famous. You can fit it together in, literally, they say 10,000 different ways, but only one is right. So that sort of drives people crazy, but it turns out that's what people like. I mean, they want to be tortured.
Well, tell us about these people who want to be tortured, right? Because we're going to know some of these names.
Well, yeah. I mean, because I sort of read that they had some, upscale clients, but they took me on a tour, and then on the wall there's pictures and letters from Bill and Melinda Gates, Jeff Bezos, Queen Elizabeth II. Let's just say that's the demographic.
But I understand it's Jeff Bezos' wife that's really into puzzles.
Well, that's what they said. We weren't able to get a comment.
Bloomberg BusinessWeek, it's available on newsstands now.
Also online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app.
So what's your must read?
Zeke Fox, his story on Tala. I mean, this is an app. First of all, Africa has been such a hotbed of activity for figuring out new ways of bringing people into the financial system.
Sure.
It's an app. It's supposed to provide small loans to help people lift them out of poverty, but it's actually creating more debt with them, and it's really kind of troubling. So deep dive into the story. He went to Africa. It's a must read.
Yeah, it's an interesting look at sort of best intentions and maybe some unintended consequences.
And maybe he has to work out a few things, no doubt about it. Your must read.
Mine's a little lighter. It's Coco Melon. I love this story. It's a classic Business Week story.
Was this Alice's choice or your choice?
It's 100% mine. And what's interesting is, this is an untold story, a guy who's never talked before, and someone who's behind one of the most popular things on the internet. And it's a story about streaming, so just a terrific read.
Very popular on YouTube. All right, check out our Daily Business Week podcast, and you can catch us on YouTube. Just visit youtube.com, search on Bloomberg Global News.
More Bloomberg Television starts right now.